like stones, all that we fall for. Homes, places we've grown, all of us are done for.
Places we've grown, all of us are done for. And we live in a beautiful world. Yeah, we do, yeah, we do. We live in a beautiful somebody to lean on.
Box time. So lunch, always eagerly looked forward to, except in these early days when it's still bitterly cold, 20 to 30 below zero at centigrade. All the food is very difficult to eat. In fact, my mouth is very sore from all the sharp edges of everything cutting into it. For example, the butter is usually reasonably soft, but it cracks. It's very crunchy. We've got these Propel bars, or high-fat bars that are normally bendable, but breaks like glass. Salami, well, you know what salami's like. Hard as nails. Cheese is the same too. If I could bite through that cheese, I'd be a very happy man. I'll break my teeth before I do that. But last of all, well, not last of all, well, we've got this pork crackling too. It's very edible, very soft and crunchy. And the chocolate. The chocolate should be very soft, but difficult to eat as well. Hard as nails. Lunch, but it's a hard lunch.
Hi guys, I hope you enjoyed our first talk with Tony. I thought it was fascinating and enjoyed the break and got to have some great conversations. Now I'm about to introduce our next speaker, but before I do so, I alluded to before that the Explorers Club, we are real explorers at the Explorers Club. As I said, our members are the first to the moon, the first to the bottom of the ocean, the first to the North Pole and the South Pole. And what actually happens with this is our members come up with expedition ideas. They're their ideas, and then they pitch these ideas to the head office in New York, and New York looks at them. And if New York thinks that it's a fantastic idea, it becomes a flagged expedition. Now, there are hundreds of expeditions going on by our members every year. Some of the expeditions are flagged and some are not. If you are flagged, that means the Explorers Club in New York has endorsed your expedition as something very significant, and they give you a flag. Right now, there are 202 flags in circulation all around the world. Now, a flag doesn't do just one expedition. A flag might go to the bottom of the Marianas Trench with James Cameron, and then it might be sent to sent into outer space with an astronaut, or it might be sent into the middle of the Amazon, and it builds up a history. And it might do 10 expeditions over its life, and then it's officially retired, and then it's placed inside in a frame at head office in New York, and the whole history of the flag is there below it, so it's there left in prosperity. Now, it's my great honour actually to say that there is there's an Australian expedition happening right now that's a flagged expedition, and that flag is here tonight.
Hey.
And I'd like to introduce Matthew Carter, who is the expedition leader, and I'll let him tell you his story about his expedition. Ladies and gentlemen, Matthew Carter.
Thanks a lot, Todd. Essentially, what we're looking at is the deepest maritime archaeological project in Australasian history. That's how we've sold our project, and that's why we've got a flag. So what we're doing is we're investigating the Japanese midget submarine that sunk off Sydney in 1942. And the whole idea behind this is that we're using technical diving, maritime archaeology, and cutting-edge 3D photogrammetry. Now, the way we're doing this, we're combining it all together, and that's why the Explorers Club, we're really thankful they've come on board, and they said this is of such scientific integrity, and it follows the kind of ideas of exploration, the ethos of exploration. This is the flag that they've given us. So this is flag 192, and it's been involved in some pretty amazing projects all around the world, and it's just a massive honour for myself and my team, including Steve Crevasses up the front here, to be awarded something like this. So this is just a little teaser. We're going to come back next year and hopefully give something equally as interesting as what we've got planned for tonight. So thank you very much, Todd, for that time, and I watch this space. Thanks.
Thank you. We look forward to your presentation. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Eric Phillips, who is a polar explorer, who will be presenting Deep Freeze, exploring the coldest places on Earth. For over 25 years, Eric Phillips has been undertaking pioneering expeditions to the Antarctic and Arctic, and in 2002, together with his friend John Muir, became the first Australian to ski to both the North Pole and the South Poles. His passions for ice and cold has taken him to the ice caps of Greenland twice, Ellesmere Island, Iceland, the southern Patagonia, and Macquarie and Heard Islands, and the Antarctic Peninsula. Eric has pioneered 2 new routes to the trans-Antarctic mountains, to the South Pole, and he's actually done that 3 times. He's a master polar guide, co-founder of the International Polar Guide Association. He's guided over 25 expeditions to both poles, and 2013 guided Prince Harry to the South Pole. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Eric Phillips.
Thank you, Todd. Oh no. Oh God, we've got a glitch already. I'm seeing a big red dot here, and I've gone to technology here, and I'm using my iPhone to do this slideshow, and of course it's not working. So I don't entirely know what to do about that. Perhaps our tech person can. Yeah. We need some mice. Yeah. No, it's talking to a laptop. We're both on the same network, and look, maybe I just need to reboot it. Or,
I use the same thing in it.
oh, you did? Okay.
I use it on the
All right. Oh, you do? Well, if the network's there, then it should work. But look, Todd, thank you so much for. It's just looking for it now. Yeah. Todd, thanks for the invitation to come speak tonight. I had the great honour of speaking. I'm going to move this out the way because I'm not going to stand in front of something and I don't want to use a microphone. I like to be all flamboyant and use my arms and legs for this kind of thing and for presenting as well. So, and I still have a red dot. So thanks for the opportunity. I spoke at the Sydney chapter last month, which was a wonderful experience. And so lovely to be back here in, yes, thank you. Back in Melbourne, which was my home for more than 10 years. So great to see some wonderful friends and faces here in the audience. You know, minus 20 is about the optimum temperature that humans should operate in because, and there's some logic in that, because at 20 below, you just want to keep moving, you want to keep active, and so long as you've got calories to put into your body, the body will just keep going because you just kind of want to generate this heat. So for me, that's one of the easy parts about being in the cold, is to actually move across from one point to another throughout the course of a day, a week, months, and into many months. And by way of introduction, I do actually have a video to show you, but I can't actually show you at the moment. So it means I'm going to do a song and a dance, which in a former life was actually part of what I did, but I don't have a guitar here and I'm not going to dance because, I've got not enough calories in me, so I can't do that either. So what I was going to do tonight was do a bit of a departure from my normal talk, and is to talk about both the North and South Pole expeditions kind of side by side, a little 24-hour snapshot of what it's like to go north and what it's like to go south. So we're talking about the Earth, and if I had a globe here in front of me like a big basketball and I had one finger at the top and one finger at the bottom and with my third hand spun it around, that would represent the globe. And the North Pole would be here, surrounded by the Arctic, and the South Pole would be down here, surrounded by Antarctica. And some people say, yes, I've been to the South Pole, when actually they mean that they've been to Antarctica. And one is inside the other, but they're actually entirely different places or different meanings. The South Pole and North Poles are so tiny that if I had a GPS and stood at that 90 degrees north, which on a handheld GPS you can do, you can get 90 degrees north. Actually, just keep that going and I'll hold that and we'll go through with this.
Sorry.
No, we won't. You've actually managed to get it. Yep, that's fine. Perfect, thank you. So, and we have those 2 points here, the North and South Poles. And we have the equator running right around the middle. Now the equator's there and it's the hot place because the sun is 90 degrees and sits mostly above that equatorial region. But when you're when it's sort of declining towards the north up here, the Arctic is starting to get warmer because the sun's moving up here. And it declines up until it's sitting above the Arctic Circle. And Antarctica's really cold and the Arctic's really warm. And then it goes back down, it gets above, and when it reaches the equinox, it's back above above the equator. And then it's declining down towards the south. And Antarctica is getting quite warm and the Arctic's getting quite cool. So that's kind of the difference between the two and why the two poles exist and why they're colder, because the sun's mostly shining in the middle of the Earth in the equatorial regions. Having said that, there's the sun there and you can see that it's still red and bright, and so maybe, I'll tell you what, probably the best thing to do is for me just to is for you to operate it for me. If you could get that connection again, and when I sort of do a shudder of my head like in a nervous tick, you can advance to the next slide or something like that. So I'm going to talk about the comparison between those two environments because they are fundamentally different. They're both extremely cold environments and they're both typified by enormous ice regions. But one is an ocean. The Arctic Ocean freezes during winter and in early spring and then starts to melt. And we go there typically right at the end of winter, which could be at the end of, as early as January into February into March. And now the expeditions that I guide to the South Pole are predominantly in April. So we're there at quite a brittle time, quite a cold time, whereas in Antarctica, we're kind of going there in summertime. And the reason for that is because the support services that fly you into Antarctica only operate from very late October through to, on the Cape Town side, into February or so. So you only have the option, unless you're deciding to winter in Antarctica, you only have the option to ski to the poles or to do other Antarctic stuff, mostly during summertime. I'm just going to trust that they have technology in their own hands. I should never have entrusted my own devices to do this, because incidentally, I have this like really weird thing where I buy electronic things and within 2 or 3 days, 80% of them don't work anymore. They're broken. So for this not to happen, for this to happen is kind of not out of the ordinary. I've always been fascinated by the cold and everything that the cold represents. In fact, when I was a little kid, I remember getting up from bed on a cold winter's morning, you know, as a 10-year-old, and walking down the corridor with my just sort of pajamas on and flicking this little heater on in the kitchen and sitting in front of the heater with all of that warm, lovely air sort of warming the front of my body and feeling like the dark side of the moon on the back with all of this kind of cold back, and I'd swivel around and warm the back of and then, you know, I'd sit there for maybe 20 minutes or so, and then people would get up. I had 5 brothers and sisters, my parents, and they'd slowly get up and inhabit the place. And it was kind of my little special thing when I was younger. A little bit like Amundsen, who when he was younger, or was it Nansen, when he was younger, in his bedroom, he would sleep in wintertime with the windows completely open, because he knew that he had a life as a polar adventurer, as a polar explorer into the future, and he wanted to attempt to harden himself through those open windows and the cold of the winter. And in fact, the Icelanders still do that in this day and age. They're youngsters, just still in the pram, maybe a few weeks old, up until maybe a year and a half. During winter time, for their afternoon snooze, Mum wheels them out on the veranda, and they sleep outside there in the cold during the heart of winter. So it's good for our constitution, and maybe that's why I'm looking reasonable at 85 years old. Not quite. So I think I'll just kind of start with a presentation anyway and sort of try to paint some pictures in. So when we get up at 6 o'clock in the morning in Antarctica, it's invariably relatively warm inside the tent. And the reason for that is because we're there in summertime, and you've got all of this sunlight beaming through the tent and creating this kind of greenhouse effect. So we don't have to sleep very heavily or very warmly in Antarctica. Most of the time I've got an average 3 to 4 season bag. I can sleep with the zipper completely open and just draped over me. I'm not necessarily wearing any headwear, despite the temperatures outside being even down to 25, 30 below. I skied to the South Pole again at the end of last year and into the start of this year. And when I arrived at the South Pole, there was a camp set up there by ALE, and that's where their visitors who are just flying into the South Pole, they camp there for a night or two. And they gave me a tent to sleep in, and each of our team members were given a tent. And it's a small red Hilleberg tent. I use a green one because they're not so hot, which is a bit of an irony in Antarctica. So I got inside that tent, and it was 10 o'clock at night, and I decided to go to sleep, and I lay on my mattress. The temperature outside was 28 below. I lay on my mattress, virtually naked, on top of my sleeping bag with both doors open, and I couldn't sleep the entire night because of the heat. So that's Antarctica for you. As a comparison, in the Arctic, we are there in February, March, April, and it's bitterly cold. You can look at the sun, and it's pretty. It's a lovely little orb up in the sky, but it's bitterly cold. You don't get any modicum of heat from that sun whatsoever. A little bit inside the tent, you kind of realize that it's doing something because, it's not quite as cold outside, but invariably, if it's 40 degrees outside, it's going to be about 35 degrees inside the tent when you wake up in the morning. So it's a really desperate, miserable place to be. We sleep inside our sleeping bags lined with a plastic bag. And I'm talking about a plastic bag that's completely impervious to moisture. Throughout the course of the day, our body gives off around 1 litre of moisture. And we need to trap that, because if we don't trap it, it goes into the fibres of the sleeping bag and it freezes before it can reach the atmosphere on the outside of the bag. It's so cold that the cold penetrates partly inside the sleeping bag, and therefore that moisture reaches a critical point and freezes before it can get out. So we need to trap that moisture, because your sleeping bag otherwise gets heavy, you can't pack it down, and it loses its capacity to insulate you. So you've got to sleep in a plastic bag. In the morning we wake up, we get out of that, and despite wearing thermals and everything, we've been cold throughout the night, but we're also drenched. So we wake up and we take our gloves off, and it's like we've been washing dishes for the last 24 hours with wrinkly fingers. We get out of there, and then we can't take those wet clothes off, because if you take them off and put them in somewhere for later. When you want them for later, they're going to be a frozen bundle of clothing, and you can do nothing with them. And we don't have enough fuel in the stove in order to melt everything and dry it out, and so we have to be very clever about it. So we keep that wet clothing on, we pile layers over the top, and once we get outside, then we can just use the warmth from our body to dry those layers out and try not to stop too much. I work on an 8-hour regime, so 8 hours sleep. Now, it doesn't really matter whether my clients or whether my expedition partners are actually sleeping or not, but the head on the pillow, reclined, 8 hours. And then we have 8 hours of skiing time. That's with a harness on, clipped into a sled and moving across the ice. And then we have another 8 hours, and for those mathematicians, they can see that 3 8s is a whole 24-hour period.
We've tried. We just can't get your phone
No worries.
to connect, but if we can bring the laptop in.
Okay.
Have it without sound.
Yeah, that's fine. No worries. Yeah, I can sing in the background. So the other 8-hour period is downtime, where we're not, sorry, am I moving around too much? I'll try to stay still. Where we're not sleeping and we're not moving across the ice is the downtime, the rests, the lunch, the packing up camp, the taking camp down, the cooking, the melting snow, everything that's not moving and not sleeping. So the 8 hours gives us a certain amount of distance that we can cover. Now, if we want to cover more distance, then we start to compress our downtime. We get more efficient and we reduce our downtime to 7 hours to 6 hours so that we can increase our distance and time on the ice to 9 hours, 10 hours. But the thing that we never do is jeopardize the amount of sleep that we have. Because once you start to mess around with the amount of sleep on a long polar expedition that could be more than 100 days on the ice, then you start to mess with the functionality of the team, the happiness of the group, and the objective of the expedition. So that's the thing that we never mess with. So I'm just going to skip the introductory video. And so there are those 2 points, of course, that I was talking about, the Arctic at the top, the Antarctic at the bottom. And the next one, please. Yeah, I think you'll operate it, right? Thank you. So Antarctica. And I've been, of course, fascinated for so many years in that central point in the South Pole, and still am very much fascinated by the South Pole, because I think symbolically it's an incredible place too, because every single person on the planet has a line of longitude passing under their feet. And where do they converge? 2 places, the North Pole and the South Pole. So those lines, in effect, connect every single person on the planet. So symbolically, they're a wonderful place, but also they happen to be in the 2 most amazing places on Earth anyway, the Arctic and Antarctica. Fascinating. So Antarctica, it's, of course, a landmass covered in ice, and we know that. The ice sits at about an average of 3 kilometers thick, so very, very dense. Imagine somewhere from here 3 kilometers away and stand it up on end. That's how thick the average ice is in Antarctica. The highest point of the ice, the plateau, is over 4,100 meters on Dome Argus, and the highest point in Antarctica is Mount Vinson, above 5,000 meters. So it's a very high continent. We know that, but it's also the driest and the windiest and all of those other wonderful things. And it's a place that I've been to many times. I don't know, I haven't, I've lost count, and skied to perhaps 7 or 8 times, and about to embark on my 3rd new route to the South Pole. For the Arctic, however, it's entirely different. If you could advance, thank you. So the Arctic is an ocean, and we know that because we often refer to the Arctic Ocean. It's surrounded by land masses, by islands, by countries, by continents, those kinds of things. And I'm fascinated in the Arctic because it's entirely different motion and engagement with this environment than it is to moving across Antarctica to the South Pole. You know, it's subject to the forces of wind and currents and tides, and so therefore there are much smaller effects that you can see and much larger effects that you can see and more instant effects that you see on the Arctic Ocean that you don't see in Antarctica. So for example, when I arrive at the South Pole, I can see a whole line of spikes in the ice running across the plateau for about 100 meters, and a geodetist comes in every year on the 1st of January and marks 90 degrees exactly. When I come back the following year, that post has moved about 15 or 20 meters in that direction, and it's lined up perfectly with all of those others. So in 1 year, it might move 10 or 15 meters. In the Arctic, I can move 10 or 15 meters in the space of a minute. So that's one of the critical differences between the 2. Thank you. So we wake up in the morning, as I said, 6 o'clock, and it's in Antarctica. Things are very warm. I've explained that. We can move on. But in Antarctica, and that kind of misty haze is very typical of photographs in the Arctic region. It looks cold, and it is cold. It's really bitter in the morning. You can see us cocooned up here, and we close everything down. The zipper's all the way up, the hood's all the way over, the aperture's closed down until it's a tiny pinprick in front of your nose, and sometimes that's too cold. So we move that over to the side, and we're kind of cocooned in this atmosphere of pretty horrid stench and moist air, but that's kind of what you have to do in order to survive. And we're wearing thick socks, and we're wearing gloves, and we're wearing hats and all kinds of things. The first thing we do when we get up in the morning, of course, is light the stove. If you could, thanks. 7 a.m, we've started the stoves going, and we're melting snow, we're reheating thermoses, we're eating, we're having breakfast, we're eating what I call my breakfast bomb, which is a concoction of instant oats and milk powder and desiccated coconut and protein powder and pecan meal, and it's a huge amount of energy encapsulated in one small package, and it energizes you throughout the hour that you've still got remaining in the tent and packing down, and the 1 or 2 hours before you'll start eating food again. So in Antarctica, even at 30 below, you can quickly go out and go to the dunny dressed like this. If you're fast enough, if you're really super fast and practice like I am, it'll take me a minute. Get the toilet paper ready, tear off a bits, whether you're a scruncher or a folder, doesn't matter, chuck it in your sleeves, just get a few little bits of clothing on, get out there, stomp a hole, do your stuff, wipe, back in, and within a minute you can be back inside. So the last thing you want to be doing is getting dressed and getting outside, because then you've got to just get undressed and do it all over again. It takes 3-4 times as long. In the Arctic, however, you really don't have that luxury. Often it kind of looks like this: desperate, dismal, foggy, overcast. And whatever you do, you try to do it as fast as you can, but sometimes you're just hampered by the cold. What we do on when we wake up in a tent on the Arctic Ocean is we check for any polar bears, and we, of course, listen out overnight. In Antarctica, I'll have earplugs in all night because I don't want to hear the snorers, and I don't want to hear the wind. I don't want to hear anything that might keep me awake at night. But in the Arctic, I need to be listening out for polar bears. I need to be listening out for the ice cracking, which could crack underneath the tent and has cracked underneath the tent before. But we also crank up the GPS because of this drifting. And we want to know our position compared to what it was last night. And it will be different. It will be different either by 100 meters or it will be different by 10 kilometers. And we could either get positive drift, which is awesome because positive drift is taking us in the direction that we want to go towards the North Pole, or we can get negative drift, which is taking us away from the pole. And that's bad threefold, because one, you wake up in the morning and you're further away from your destination. Two, you are still moving backwards while you're still trying to go towards your destination. And number three, I've forgotten what it is. So moving on to 8 a.m. So 8 a.m, so we're dressed now, and we're kind of in our first little few minutes going. If we're lucky, maybe it's taken 2 hours. Invariably, it takes a little bit longer with a guided team, maybe 2.5, and even 3 hours in the first few days of the trip, or first week or so. And we're dressed very warmly, particularly in Antarctica. Up on the plateau, it's windy a lot of the time, and the routes that I take to the South Pole are mostly into the wind. This wind's coming from kind of the southeast, if you like, sort of on the left-hand side, so we're very warmly dressed. We've got a layer of thermals, we've got a layer of fleece, and then a shell windproof jacket and pants over the top with a fur ruff that we have around attached to the rim of the hood, and we would have very thick socks on and polar boots and a liner mittens and then polar mittens over the top and a buff around our neck and then a face mask made of neoprene and then goggles or sunglasses and then a warm hat, and then we're kind of ready to go. In the Arctic, similarly dressed. We're on skis most of the time. In terrain like this in the Arctic Ocean, we might be taking our skis off from time to time and just clambering over those pressure ridges, but kind of quite similar. On the Arctic Ocean, I use amphibious sleds, and these are sleds that my company produces and manufactures and sells around the world. And these amphibious sleds, well, actually the reason I make them will become a bit clearer later on. Thank you. So we're starting to build up some ice here because inside your body or inside a thermos is going to freeze pretty quickly at 20, 30, 40, into the 50s below, God forbid. So after maybe an hour or so, you're starting to get this accretion of ice. So you're breathing out, that's moisture. It collects on the first thing it finds, which is invariably your face mask or some sort of other clothing, and maybe even inside your goggles or your sunglasses. And that makes life pretty miserable because you're starting to lose your capacity to see the route ahead. This is actually a picture of John Mullen, the current chairman of Telstra, who I took to the South Pole, the North Pole this year on a last degree expedition. And in fact, you probably guys would have heard of him because he is quite a pioneer in Australia, I think, in deep water maritime history, and well, not a pioneer, but highly interested in it. And this is a temperature of 44 below that we had this year. And John's quite experienced in his 20s in Alaska. He did some mega trips with friends and also solo, but not quite familiar with 44 below, but familiar with the harshness of a polar environment and what it takes just to be on the trail for successive days and weeks on end. So here, similarly, we're breathing out, but the advantage we have in the Arctic, we don't necessarily need to wear eyewear a lot. The sun's much lower, it's not burning our eyes out. We don't have the same kind of winds either. The wind's often changing. It's not as harsh and not as brittle as it is on the Antarctic plateau. Thank you. Navigation is really interesting in Antarctica, and I love it. And it's very rare for me to take out a compass in Antarctica, and never would I take out a GPS while I'm on the trail in Antarctica either. Because all I've got to do is get the position at the beginning of the trip, because if it's a route that is just never going to change and is just going due south, it's highly unlikely that my route or my magnetic bearing is going to change on the compass either. So if I'm on 85, whatever, I can stick on 85. If I'm deviating and not concentrating enough, then I might change by 1 degree over the course of, a week or so, but mostly the direction doesn't change. And that makes navigation interesting more than anything. We wake up in the morning and the sun will be out to the east. We're traveling south, and we're going to structure our day and structure our time so that the sun rotates behind us and then comes around to the west in the late afternoon. We want to have the sun behind us so it doesn't burn our eyes out. But also it casts a shadow ahead of us, and we can use that shadow for navigation like a sundial. So right at midday, we can actually be walking on our shadow and we're going directly to the South Pole. And we determine what midday is, whether it's 1, 2, 12, 11, whatever it is. We know exactly when it is, and when 11 comes around, that hour up to 11 is pretty easy because we're kind of mostly going south. 11's or midday is perfect because we're walking due south, and then a little bit after that's great. And then we've got to start concentrating again because we know that our shadow or the sun moves 15 arc minutes over the course of 60 minutes. So it moves 15 degrees every hour. So if we just have in our mind where the sun should be at any given time of day, judging by what our watch is saying, we can navigate without a compass. Secondly, we can use the wind. And mostly the wind's coming from over here, so I have on my ski pole a little thread or a ribbon or something, and if the wind's blowing, it's always kind of fluttering in that same direction. So if we've got overcast conditions and navigation by the sun or shadow is impossible, I can usually navigate by the wind. If there's no wind and we've got overcast conditions, then most of the time I can navigate by the striations. If there's been a weather event, then it lays patterns on the snow, and they'll be formed in the direction of the wind, and once you lock into then you can use that for navigating as well. And if worse comes to worse, then of course we can always get the compass out. The Arctic is somewhat different. So at 10 a.m. by now we're thinking, well, wouldn't it be great just to have a flat surface and a shadow and the sun to do everything we want to do to get us to the North Pole? No, we've got pressure ridges, we've got no flat surface, but what we have here is the sun directly in front of us. So we structure our day now to have the sun arcing in front of us because the sun's much lower. It doesn't burn your eye out. Often there's fog and stuff, that obscures the sun, and you might just get a little glimpse through, and that's great. You don't want to be skiing towards the North Pole and constantly looking back to see where the sun is to navigate. And you also don't want to be looking at your compass all the time and your GPS. So this time, on a trip like the North Pole, we want to have the sun out front to use for navigation purposes. And then we kind of follow this really meandering, convoluted line across the Arctic for 800, 900, maybe 1,000 kilometres to the North Pole, and we just do the best to stay on the same navigational bearing. Thank you. In Antarctica, 11 o'clock, well, we've run into a crevasse field. Now, they can be anywhere. Now, the routes that I'm doing recently are taking me up untrodden glaciers. So the Reedy Glacier last year, up the Kansas Glacier this year, and maybe the opportunity to do the Liv Glacier next year. And in 98, 99, had the opportunity to make the first ascent of the Shackleton Glacier, which is wedged between the classic British route up the Beardmore and the Norwegian route up the Axel Heiberg Glacier. So from the air, that's what a crevasse field looks like. The next slide shows it a little closer up, and you'd be a pretty foolish navigator, adventurer, guide, explorer to be ending up in the middle of one of those crevasse fields, because you've been either asleep or you've had your eyes closed or whatever. So you don't want to do that. And if you do that, then you're going to have a hell of a time getting out of it. And you've been lucky not to fall into a crevasse. The next slide shows what it's like to be at the surface level and what they look like. So you'd be skiing across here and you'd reach that edge and you'd have no problem even just kind of teetering over the edge. But then do you make the decision, do you walk across that? And is it going to be strong enough to hold your weight or not? So a few prods with the pole, maybe we rope up, maybe we sort of find a way around. You can see that it's converging at the far end, it's tapering off, and if we were unsure about this bridge, we could walk around and we could be a bit safe. And you can see over here too, that looks pretty dodgy, because the wind's coming from up here and the windward side of a crevasse is usually a bit weaker. So we're okay in the first part of the crevasse, but the last part where I'm prodding and trying to determine whether it's okay, and then I usually shuffle across that bit really fast. I've never gone through a crevasse and don't intend to, but there's always a first time. But of course we take crevasse rescue equipment and all of the proper climbing gear to both avoid and to rescue if we were in that situation. Thank you. So on the Reedy Glacier this year, high up as we're emerging up onto the plateau, it's typical to get these very wide crevasses that often open up, and these are the sorts of things that a bridge could cover, and if it was weak enough that you would plummet into and hopefully be rescued by your pals. Thank you. You do get cracks in the ice on the Arctic Ocean as well, but they don't reveal abysses below, they reveal the dark and menacing liquid abyss underneath, which is the Arctic Ocean. And I judge the thickness of the ice by the colour of the ice. And white, pure white like that, no problem, could be 2 metres thick, and that's fine. You could ski on it, you could ride a bike, you could drive a car, you could land aeroplanes on it. 1.7 metres thick is fine. They can land an Antonov 74 on that stuff, a big Russian jet. But then it starts to get thinner, and the thinner it gets, the darker it gets. And we need to be very, very careful about stepping onto this stuff here, this black liquid death. If you step onto that, I know that stuff won't hold your weight, even with skis on. It will take you for a little while, and you'll go like on this spongy little trampoline, and eventually you'll go through after maybe a metre or two. This stuff, kind of okay. It'll be a little bit spongy as you go, but eventually if you wander onto that black stuff, you'll go through. As my friend John Muir did back in 2002 when we were skiing almost 1,000 kilometres from Russia to the North Pole. And I'd crossed a lead and taken half an hour to determine whether the ice would hold my weight. Eventually I decided that it would, and I left my sled on this side, went across with a long rope attached to it and said, "John, you're fine, come across." John, as you guys know, would be about 20 kilos heavier, and halfway across I'm just watching the ice sponging, because the salt content in the water gives it this elasticity. So as you're walking, it's sponging and it's dropping, and I called out, "John, I think you should," which is as far as I got, because then he plunged through the water, through the ice up to his neck into the drink. At that point, a ski came off his foot as he was thrashing about, and that went to the bottom of the ocean. And we spent the next 3 days in the tent drying him out and sort of manufacturing a ski binding out of whatever bits and pieces I could butcher from the equipment, which I managed to do. I made a ski binding and it lasted for the rest of the trip. The only reason I could do that is because I made my own ski bindings for my first North Pole expedition. They were so successful that I actually now manufacture ski bindings and sell them around the world, including to the Norwegian and US militaries. So this is kind of what a lead looks like. Thank you. And now with these amphibious sleds that I make, I can raft them together and use them as ferries to cross the water, or I can use this technique. Thank you. So the first time I tried that, many years ago, of course I was pretty reticent, pretty nervous about it, and now I've done it literally dozens of times in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, a long way for any help if something goes wrong. And now when I'm confronted by a lead of open water, I'm just energized, and it's like, yes, this is what I've been waiting for. And the clients are a little bit like nervous, and it's like, what the hell, why are you looking so happy about this? And then once I swim across and set up a ferry and attach ropes to that, and they get on top and with their knees and hands, and they get ferried across, they understand the sheer beauty of the technique, but also the sheer adventure of what they're doing in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. Thank you. Well, by noon we may have had a visitor in Antarctica. This is a skua, and a skua is kind of like an Antarctic gull. It's very common in Antarctica, mostly in the coastal areas. And they're pretty bold little characters. They'll come up, and this one sat on my sled and had lunch with me and tried to land on my knee and pick a bit of food and so on. But you don't see them very often inland, although when John Muir and Peter Hillary and I skied to the South Pole in 98, 99, we'd made our way through the Transantarctic Mountains and perched up above 2,000 meters and had a skua land on the tent in the middle of the night. First, we didn't know what it was. It's like we're dreaming. We opened the tent, and there's this little skua on the ice perch next to us. They have actually been known to fly into the South Pole a long way from the coast. The closest water coastline to the South Pole is around about 1,400 kilometres, thereabouts. In the Arctic, of course, an entirely different environment. And it has the largest land-living or ice-living carnivore on Earth, the polar bear. And the polar bear is there in its own habitat. And the polar bear needs to consume around about 2 kilograms of fat every day in order to combat the cold and to survive in that kind of environment. And it's very opportunist. It'll hunt seals because that's its major form of food. Any kind of seals, really. It's not really that fussy. If it runs out of seals, then it'll go for beluga or it'll go for walrus. And if it runs out of those or can't find those, then it'll take whatever it can. Rodents or foxes or whatever, birds, and if they can't find any of those and it finds us, then we're the next in the food chain. So we need to be very prepared when we go into that environment. So we take a Magnum 44 and a 30-06 caliber rifle, and I take flare guns, and I take a perimeter wire that I put around the tent, not so much on the Arctic Ocean, but in Svalbard when I run my trips there, that set off little flares and noisy things. But you got to be a little careful, because I remember being confronted by, a friend of mine told me a story in Alaska. He was confronted by a grizzly, and he had some flares, and he thought, well, that's a bit scary. So he shot the flare towards the bear, and the flare went over the bear, and the bear turns around and looks at the flare and thinks, well, that's pretty scary, and bolts straight towards the guy. So I was a bit loath to use it. So we did see a bear. John and I did see a bear about 2 weeks into the trip, and so I just, casually just stopped and took out my running shoes and, put them on. He said, what the hell are you doing, Harry? You can't outrun a polar bear. John, I don't need to. I just need to outrun you. So no, I didn't take any running shoes with me. But we were kind of prepared as much as we could to combat a polar bear. Thankfully, it stopped about 20 meters short, and it stood up and it looked at us and it sniffed, and it was upwind. And then it went down and it was sort of sidling around and then stood up again to the side of us and got down. And then as soon as it got downwind of us, it took one whiff and ran away. But we were very energized by that. We slept actually very well that night, despite the imminent threat of being in the vicinity of a polar bear. Thank you. Well, we're getting pretty hungry by now. We've already had a short food break, consumed some chocolate, maybe some nuts and a bar and some butter, and consumed some fluids. But this is lunch. Thank you. Where's the audio coming? Oh, okay. Is that Max?
Literally cold, 20 to 30 below zero. At centigrade, all the food is very difficult to eat. In fact, my mouth is very sore from all the sharp edges of everything cutting into it. For example, the butter is usually reasonably soft. Very crunchy. Got the propel bars or high fat bars that are normally bendable, but
I remember I did go to the dentist after that trip, and I spent a lot of money on my teeth. I had cracks and fractures all the way through them. These days, of course, we get a thermos, hot water, and put the cheese and salami in there, and sort of try to thaw it out a bit before we get stuck into it. Thanks. 2 p.m. We've really struck it lucky in Antarctica because the surface has totally flattened out. And this is an area of very low wind. That's the only reason why we don't have any features on the surface here. There's just no wind in this part of Antarctica. And it literally is totally void of any sort of lumps. A few little things here and there, but really nothing that's going to hinder your progress whatsoever. The snow is incredibly cold, really cold. And for Kate Leeming, who's in the audience here, who has for a number of years tried to raise funds to become the first person to cycle across Antarctica, and has experience already in Svalbard with myself, had the honour of being with her in Svalbard on a training trip, has been to Greenland and to Canada this year as part of her training. Her toughest gig will be cycling in this kind of environment, and you will know it well. It's so dry that nothing gets traction up here. And Kate has this incredible bike that has this two-wheel drive system where you can disengage from the chain and hit this lever, and you're still using a similar system where it engages some rods, or even better now. There you go. So the system that I saw back in Svalbard was a series of cogs engaging and sort of rods that came down and engaged these two and gave her two-wheel drive. And that was pretty good, but I was on this trip with a guy who took a bike with him, a fat bike, Keith Tuffley. And once he got to this area of Antarctica, he could not ride even for half a metre. It was virtually impossible. It was impossible to ride. So very difficult. It's so dry that the crystalline structure of the snow it just completely breaks apart, so it doesn't give you any traction whatsoever. Thank you. But it can quickly change into fields of sastrugi. Sastrugi are generated by the wind. They're wind-formed ridges of snow, and they form into beautiful structures like this one over on the left here. But they can be a pain in the ass too. They can hinder your progress. They can reach to elevation of 2 meters high, difficult to get around. If you're lucky enough, you might see them in the distance and try to veer around them. But mostly, certainly in the band between 86 and 87 degrees on the plateau, you're going to be struck by very large fields of sastrugi that will slow your progress down from those flat regions, which could give you up to 6 kilometres an hour. You'll be grinding down to 1.5 to 2 kilometres an hour.
Is that guy on a bike at the back?
Yeah, so that's Keith. And because we're in the sastrugi region, this is an area of wind, and therefore the wind tends to flatten and harden the snow. So Keith Tuffley brought his bike on this expedition that we did, a new route up the Reedy Glacier just this last season. And I said, you're crazy, you're not going to get anywhere on this bike, you don't have the right technology. And he took it to Punta Arenas, which is the start of the trip where the base is. And he said, Eric, I'm taking this bike despite all of my advice not to take it. And I said, Keith, why do you want to take this bike? It could jeopardize us, it's going to hinder us, it's going to slow us down. He said, Eric, because it makes me happy. And you know what? I couldn't argue against that. So lo and behold, in the plane went the bike, and he took it, and he rode 51% of the trip, which is the furthest that anyone's ridden on a bike in Antarctica towards the South Pole. Many people have taken a bike to the South Pole, not many, sorry, a handful of people, even a smaller handful of people, but most of them have pushed their bike for significant distances. Thanks. In the Arctic, we could get equally lucky on an area of refrozen lead, and it is super flat. Here you really don't get a ripple whatsoever. It's hard and it's often fast, but sometimes there's so much salt content coming out of this growth of refreezing lead, the salt content actually slows the sled and your skis down, so it can often grind us down to halt too. But if it's more than a few days old, then the salt content kind of percolates out or gets diffused, and we certainly can speed up a bit. But it's not always like that. Sometimes we get these incredible frost flowers growing from freshly frozen leads, and they're quite exquisite, beautiful things to look at on a microscopic scale. But on a macroscopic scale, sometimes it looks like that. Okay, so here we're lucky enough still to be on skis, and we can find a little route between the pressure ridges and the softer snow on the right side here, and we can manage to keep going north, but really at a speed of maybe 1 kilometre an hour or so. It really does tend to slow us down. Thank you. Often we've got to reach back and grab the handle and just manhandle it through the pressure ridges. Thank you. In Antarctica, 3 o'clock, we're really starting to wind down now. We've covered almost 20 kilometres, dragging sleds of upwards of, well, on my first South Pole expedition, almost 200 kilograms per person. On a trip like the Reedy Glacier, we're up around 90 kilos per person. And we stop, and in Antarctica, it's often sunny and it's windless, and we can sit on a mattress leaning up against our sleds, and we can really kick back and relax. But I remember I did go to the dentist after that trip, and I spent a lot of money on my teeth. I had cracks and fractures all the way through them. These days, of course, we get a thermos, hot water, and put the cheese and salami in there, and sort of try to thaw it out a bit before we get stuck into it. Thanks. 2 p.m. We've really struck it lucky in Antarctica because the surface has totally flattened out. And this is an area of very low wind. That's the only reason why we don't have any features on the surface here. There's just no wind in this part of Antarctica. And it literally is totally void of any sort of lumps. A few little things here and there, but really nothing that's going to hinder your progress whatsoever. The snow is incredibly cold, really cold. And for Kate Leeming, who's in the audience here, who has for a number of years tried to raise funds to become the first person to cycle across Antarctica, and has experience already in Svalbard with myself, had the honour of being with her in Svalbard on a training trip, has been to Greenland and to Canada this year as part of her training. Her toughest gig will be cycling in this kind of environment, and you will know it well. It's so dry that nothing gets traction up here. And Kate has this incredible bike that has this 2-wheel drive system where you can disengage from the chain and hit this lever, and you're still using a similar system where it engages some rods, or even better now. There you go. So the system that I saw back in Svalbard was a series of cogs engaging and sort of rods that came down and engaged these two and gave her 2-wheel drive. And that was pretty good, but I was on this trip with a guy who took a bike with him, a fat bike, Keith Tuffley. And once he got to this area of Antarctica, he could not ride even for half a metre. It was virtually impossible. It was impossible to ride. So very difficult. It's so dry that the crystalline structure of the snow it just completely breaks apart, so it doesn't give you any traction whatsoever. Thank you. But it can quickly change into fields of sastrugi. Sastrugi are generated by the wind. They're wind-formed ridges of snow, and they form into beautiful structures like this one over on the left here. But they can be a pain in the ass too. They can hinder your progress. They can reach to elevation of 2 meters high, difficult to get around. If you're lucky enough, you might see them in the distance and try to veer around them. But mostly, certainly in the band between 86 and 87 degrees on the plateau, you're going to be struck by very large fields of sastrugi that will slow your progress down from those flat regions, which could give you up to 6 kilometres an hour. You'll be grinding down to 1.5 to 2 kilometres an hour.
Is that guy on a bike at the back?
Yeah, so that's Keith. And because we're in the sastrugi region, this is an area of wind, and therefore the wind tends to flatten and harden the snow. So Keith Tuffley brought his bike on this expedition that we did, a new route up the Reedy Glacier just this last season. And I said, you're crazy, you're not going to get anywhere on this bike, you don't have the right technology. And he took it to Punta Arenas, which is the start of the trip where the base is. And he said, Eric, I'm taking this bike despite all of my advice not to take it. And I said, Keith, why do you want to take this bike? It could jeopardize us, it's going to hinder us, it's going to slow us down. He said, Eric, because it makes me happy. And you know what? I couldn't argue against that. So lo and behold, in the plane went the bike, and he took it, and he rode 51% of the trip, which is the furthest that anyone's ridden on a bike in Antarctica towards the South Pole. Many people have taken a bike to the South Pole, not many, sorry, a handful of people, even a smaller handful of people, but most of them have pushed their bike for significant distances. Thanks. In the Arctic, we could get equally lucky on an area of refrozen lead, and it is super flat. Here you really don't get a ripple whatsoever. It's hard and it's often fast, but sometimes there's so much salt content coming out of this growth of refreezing lead, the salt content actually slows the sled and your skis down, so it can often grind us down to halt too. But if it's more than a few days old, then the salt content kind of percolates out or gets diffused, and we certainly can speed up a bit. But it's not always like that. Sometimes we get these incredible frost flowers growing from freshly frozen leads, and they're quite exquisite, beautiful things to look at on a microscopic scale. But on a macroscopic scale, sometimes it looks like that. Okay, so here we're lucky enough still to be on skis, and we can find a little route between the pressure ridges and the softer snow on the right side here, and we can manage to keep going north, but really at a speed of maybe 1 kilometre an hour or so. It really does tend to slow us down. Thank you. Often we've got to reach back and grab the handle and just manhandle it through the pressure ridges. Thank you. In Antarctica, 3 o'clock, we're really starting to wind down now. We've covered almost 20 kilometres, dragging sleds of upwards of, on my first South Pole expedition, almost 200 kilograms per person. On a trip like the Reedy Glacier, we're up around 90 kilos per person. And we stop, and in Antarctica, it's often sunny and it's windless, and we can sit on a mattress leaning up against our sleds, and we can really kick back and relax. But these kites are now proven to be the most efficient form of travel in Antarctica. The record in a 24-hour period is more than 600 kilometres in expedition mode, dragging a sled on skis. The record for a single season in Antarctica is more than 5,000 kilometres. I was lucky enough to have been involved in the pioneering phase of bringing kite skiing into Antarctica into the polar regions when in '95 I used kites to cross Greenland. The wind power had been used before, as early as Scott back in his time, putting rudimentary sails up on his sleds, but these very clever ram air steerable kites were certainly in their infancy in the early 90s. Thanks. 1995 doesn't mean it needs to be pixelated. I'll see if I can somehow improve that. But there in the Arctic Ocean, almost never any opportunity to use a kite just because of this kind of terrain. In this kind of situation, we're off the skis and we're clambering and just trying to make our way as best we can through these colossal blocks of rubble. Thanks. Well, at the beginning of the day, all of this moisture coming out in the first 10 minutes perhaps, ends up as a little frozen snotty bit underneath your nose here, and then maybe after an hour or so you start to get what we call the snotsicle, and that's growing off the end of your nose piece, whatever, sometimes even directly off the end of your nose, and that snotsicle gets a little bit longer and to the point where if you're a bit thirsty you could probably lap it up, a little bit salty, but you can and then if you dribble from the mouth, then you're going to have something growing out of your off your Antarctica and all of those kind of weird and wonderful things, and we have no choice but to look. I could make the choice and start from the other side of Antarctica, as you do from Queen Maud Land, and ski with the wind in your back, and I've done a shorter trip of 2 or 3 degrees. The trip that I did with Prince Harry, we had the wind mostly in our back, and quite frankly, it was a bit too easy.
Daisy.
What is one of your biggest snotsicles?
Daisy, that's a great question. Actually, I'm not. I don't sport the biggest snotsicles because they come out of my nose. I drip incessantly from my nose, and they just grow kind of as long as that one there. But John Muir, that picture of Chewbacca there with that big snotsicle. Actually, I have to say that Peter Hillary one time had a giant snotsicle coming off his chin, and we stopped and we had our break and we were having lunch, and like a loose tooth, he just spent the whole 15, 20 minutes wiggling this, and finally he went, snapped it off and went, ta-da! Well, little did he realise his whole beard came off with the snot, and there's just this hairy kind of spike that he had in his hand, and we were kind of sniggering, actually. Yeah.
I've got a comment to say.
Is that Ben down the back?
Let's go take the comment first.
Mark.
Just it's interesting when Eric was talking about when John fell into that lead, and they had to stop for 3 days to dry out the
Yeah.
equipment. we were back in Melbourne when the early technology, then we had this tracking system of them going towards the North Pole. So there's this red line going, thinking, oh, doing great, doing great. And then for about 3 days it stopped and it went in a loop. And we were all freaking out. We took all the kids up to Puppy Millie and that to try and sort of relax. And it was them just on an ice
Yeah,
in the surface
yeah.
that dried out.
Yes, exactly right. And we, and also our, you might remember too that our tracking beacon went on the blink for a while, and then it went completely, you know, off. We were completely off the radar, and the media got hold of this, and they got really concerned, and they were knocking on Brigitte and Susie's doors at 6 o'clock in the morning, saying, "We need updates. Where are your husbands? They've been eaten by bears. They've gone through the ice. They're dead. They're not coming back." It's like, what? No, I'm sure they're okay. And so eventually our wives were forced to go and mount a, well, yeah, I say forced, but yeah, actually they probably were. They didn't really care. Or I shouldn't say that. They were confident that we were okay, but they did send out a search plane. And while we were perched next to that bit of open water, having our dilemma, a plane flew over us. And it's like, wow, that's interesting, amazing. You know, here we are in the middle of nowhere. And then it did a second loop, and then a third loop. It's like, this is pretty weird. What's going on here? Afterwards, we realised that our tracking beacon had gone on the blink. They sent out a search plane to look for us. Incredibly, they found us, extrapolating from 3 or 4 days earlier our position and looking at the ice drift, and they found us, and they reported back to our wives, "Ah, yes, we found tent with happy hands waving from the door." It's like, that's all they needed. That's all they needed.
Eric, I just wondered how the frequency and duration of the blizzards is changing climate.
I'm noticing very little in Antarctica. On the peninsula, of course, absolutely. It's decimated there. It's, there's the penguins are in decline. The glaciers are in retreat. There's grass growing on the hills, all of those kinds of things. The peninsula is in a really bad state, as the Arctic Ocean is in a really bad state. Every year we seem to have lower and lower ice coverage. And there's more frequency of wind and storms now in the Arctic Ocean than I've seen before. And because there's more wind and more storms and less ice, we're seeing a lot more drift these days as well. You know, imagine a bathtub full of ice blocks, and you're a little microscopic thing on one of those ice blocks, and you put that same fan that I was sitting in front of as a kid at one end of the bath and pushing all of that ice down to one end. You know, that's us there, and all of that other stuff at this end is all open water. You know, and if you need to get to that other side of the bathtub where it's open, you've got a really hard time of it. If you pour more ice in there, then yeah, you can step from one block to another. But because now there's only a half a bathtub full of ice in the Arctic Ocean, it's really difficult. So our days are numbered skiing to the North Pole.
Guys, if you have any more questions, can we do it in the back? One more question.
What happened to the guy's bike? Is it still in South?
No, absolutely not. No, we flew it out. No, so for the last 50% of the trip, almost 50% of the trip, he had strapped it to the top of his sled, and he actually dragged the 15 kilos of bike across the ice with him. Yep.
Any more questions, guys? We're not in the night right now. We're more than welcome to chat in the bar. Now, can I just ask Tony to come down here and just join me as we wrap up? It's our second evening of adventure in Melbourne. I'm really happy about that. This is going to be ongoing. It's going to be ongoing mainly because we have the amazing support of the Sun Theatre and our good member and friend Michael G. Smith. Thank you so much. Tonight would not have been possible. Like at Explorers Club, we're all volunteers. So basically, you know, we've got Chris Jansen, Steve Travaris, Casimir Zell on the camera, doing an amazing job. Michael Smith, as you already know, and is it Anna? Amy. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. I'd just like to finish by saying one thing. I have a role at the Explorers Club. I have a role at the Australian Geographic Society, and I'm often asked, what is the role of explorers, adventurers in today's society? And their role is you know, Eric does his amazing polar trips. Tony does his solar car challenges, and through their media, through writing books, through giving talks like this, you know, Eric will inspire someone to go to Antarctica. Or you don't have to go to Antarctica. You might just decide to get off your lounge chair and learn how to cross-country ski and learn how to build a snow cave. Tony could inspire someone to become an engineer. That's the role of explorers and adventurers in today's society, and I'd just like to applaud them for sharing their stories and welcoming everyone to Explorers Club. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Todd. Cheers. Thanks very much.